everyone. This is an Impact Story interview. My name is Jeannie Daniel, and I work for the Yale Alumni Association. Let's welcome Rebecca Walker, class of 1992, and Lily Diamond, class of 2005.
Hello, are we being welcomed right now? Hello.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi, so great to be here with our fellow Yaleys making impact.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so to start, I would like the both of you to tell us, how did you both end up at Yale?
Lily, you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. I grew up in Hawaii, actually, on the island of Maui. And growing up, I had a very strong sense that I wanted to end up in college on the other side of the world. Not because I don't love Maui, I love it deeply, and I live back here on the island now. But because I just had a very strong sense that there was a larger scope of human experience that I wanted to live through. And so I had a funny pathway to Yale, which was that I was certain I was going to go to a very small liberal arts college, and I visited many, and I was not satisfied with any of them. I ultimately felt like, they were either too pretentious or they were too much like the high school that I was in at the time. They weren't going to push me enough. And very fortunately, I had a couple of English teachers. I've always been a writer. They cornered me one afternoon in the hallway, and they said that they would never speak to me again if I didn't apply to Yale. And so through the force of their will, I ended up applying early to Yale, and I am thrilled that I got in and I found my way there to the campus. I fell in love with it. And that was how I got myself from Maui over to Yale.
That is quite the experience. Wow.
That
Rebecca,
is.
what about you?
I'm trying to really piece it together. I had, I grew up in San Francisco and New York. And when I was in high school, I was living in San Francisco. And I was going to a very wonderful school called the Urban School, which is, it was founded by hippies in the 60s. And by the time I got there, it was a bit more academically rigorous and traditional, but still very progressive and very sort of open. We didn't have tests. We had these long written evaluations. We called our teachers by their first names. And it was a wonderful, wonderful place. But it was really the opposite of Yale in many ways. I thought of Yale as very traditional and staid in some ways. And in terms of things like white supremacy and institutionalized racism, I perceived Yale as very much being a bastion of all of that. And so I was not necessarily drawn to it as a potential school. On the other hand, I ended up being a production assistant on a film. My mother's Alice Walker, she's a writer, and we were making the film The Color Purple, and I got my first job in the movie business as a PA on that film.
Wow.
And I know that's pretty cool. So anyway, so my boss on that set was a fantastic human being named Bruce Cohen, who I love to this day, who basically said to me after working with me throughout the process of shooting the film, "You must go to Yale. You are a total Yalie." And the same thing like Lily's teachers, "I will never speak to you again if you don't apply." Like it's so you. And of course I thought to myself, that's completely impossible. But I love you so much, Bruce, that I'm going to do this and believe in you. And then when it came time to visit schools, so I did my application, like blah, blah, blah. And then we went to visit schools. And I got to the Yale campus, and the first thing that I saw was the the construction of shanties on Beinecke Plaza. And so there was the anti-apartheid movement was really in full swing on campus, and people were demonstrating and shouting at the trustees as they went into their meeting that we had to divest from South Africa. And it was just, so activism was very much alive and well on campus. And that was very moving to me and very persuasive. And I also just fell in love with Yale, I think, in the way that so many people who come to campus do. You know, it's an ineffable feeling. And I felt it. And then I went to all these other schools, and none of them had that. None of them had the activism. None of them had the kind of sort of frisson of our campus, you know. And so I decided to go, and I am thrilled that I did. Of course, I had a lot of issues. The first thing that someone said to me when I got to campus, when they were showing me to my room in Vanderbilt, was, well, you probably got in because you're Black. And at that point, I did not have the awareness or the strength of mind to say to them, well, you probably got in because you're a congressman's son. You know, I didn't, you know, so I was very taken aback. And there were many moments like that in my early days of Yale, throughout my Yale experience, when race came up in very important, challenging ways that made me really question whether or not I should be there. But at the end of the day, you know, some of my closest friends, you know, friendships were forged at Yale. My own sort of intellectual capacity and way of seeing the world was really honed there. And I'm very, very happy that I made that choice.
I think we are also very happy that you both made that choice. And I love that you both had somebody who was your champion for applying and actually going to Yale. That's really great.
Yeah.
So one thing that I would like to ask both of you is, how did the two of you meet? We're going to talk today a little bit about your impact and what you're doing today, but how did you actually meet each other, since you were not at Yale at the same time?
Yeah, we met through Yale. Interestingly enough, here on Maui, there's a Yale alumni club, and they had sent out an email to everyone in the group about a visiting writer who was, you know, teaching this incredible master class. I was at a professional juncture in my life where I was looking to reconnect with my writing, and I received this email that was about, you know, this extraordinary best-selling author and activist Rebecca Walker, who would be teaching the Art of Memoir masterclass on Maui. I had been actively looking for a writing course to take, and I was thinking I would have to go, you know, somewhere far off into, you know, outside of Hawaii and certainly outside of Maui to find what I was looking for. And instead I received this email. And in, you know, sort of homegrown alumni club fashion, nobody was BCC'd on the email. And so Rebecca's email was actually on, you know, visible to everyone. And so I just thought, well, what better way to, you know, learn more about this person and this this course than to email Rebecca. And by the way, it had said, you know, that Rebecca's work focused on, you know, issues of race, identity, sexuality, and these were all subject matters that I had spent really my entire time at Yale being steeped in, studying. You know, so much of that was the formative sort of materia of my intellect as I was growing up. And so it was very exciting to me as I was reconnecting with myself as a writer to think about, oh, wow, yes, these are really the areas that I want to be focusing on. So I sent off this email, and lo and behold, I now know it's very unusual, but Rebecca actually responded to me within just a few minutes. And I had said something like, you know, well, I'd love to learn more about your work, and I want to take this course, and who knows what else. And she wrote back and said, well, the best way to learn more about my work is to read one of my books, which I thought was genius. And actually true.
Smart.
And so I went and I got a copy of Rebecca's first memoir, Black, White, and Jewish. And I remember I took it to a coffee shop and I sat there and I read the whole book in an afternoon. And I felt so incredibly connected to that narrative of, split identity, of really reckoning with identity. Growing up in Hawaii, questions of, race and class and cultural intermingling and power and the recentness of our colonial history and the ways that white supremacy have a hold in so much of culture here, and in particular in the exploitation of Native Hawaiian culture for tourism. All of these issues, were up for me growing up. And of course, then, I had a very different experience going to Yale and actually experiencing a lot more whiteness than I had growing up in my life here in Hawaii. And so I found this, through a totally different lens, but as someone who is also, from Ashkenazi Jewish background, both of my parents are Jews. I felt a really deep resonance in reading Rebecca's work, and I was so excited to go into the course and took the class and experienced what was the beginnings of this now 11 years of mentorship and then collaboration and friendship that Rebecca and I have had together. But the start of that really was my being given this opportunity to be a student and to learn what it meant to reckon with my own story and to be honest about my own story, which at the time was one of tremendous grief. I had lost my mother just a year before. And I was really, as I said, I was in this professional moment of reckoning and change, and I was finding a way to articulate truths that were very scary for me as a young woman, that, I knew if I said these things, they would alter the course of my life. And Rebecca's Art of Memoir class, a seminar, was a way for so many people to find space to actually articulate those kinds of truths that are scary because they are so hot, they are so powerful, they are so real that once you say them, they can't help but change the way that your life will look from that point forward. So that is my version of how Rebecca and I met.
That is a wonderful story. Rebecca, do you want to add anything? Was it the same for you? I love how much of an impact you've had on Lily's life.
Yeah, and she's had a great impact on mine. I think that was a great rendition of our story in many ways. Of course, I don't remember the email, but I'm happy that she does, and that's kind of classic in our relationship, that I forget many of the small details, but manage to hold on to the kind of big picture. And I think for me, the big picture of us coming together really had to do with how open and brilliant and longing, seeking, that Lily came to the course with all of the tools that she needed to rewrite her story, to look honestly at where she had been, where she was at that moment, and kind of crack that open and try to write herself into the future, write this new being, this healed being into being. And as a teacher, as a mentor, as many teachers and mentors, and will tell you, it's quite rare actually to find a student who is perfectly in some ways matched to your skill set, to what you have to give. And so when you do find that person, when you recognize something there, it's a great gift, because as a teacher, you cannot be fully realized until you find the students who are ready for what you have, and so I think that is what I remember the most. And I remember her bright red hair and the sort of lioness of her soul. Um, and then as we worked together more and more, Lily had and still has, you know, a great ability to um, to be supportive in an important way, to give back, you know, as a student, you know, to the teacher, to not just extract and take. She has also a real consciousness that I think comes from growing up on Maui, in addition to many other things, and navigating everything else that she's just talked about, so that the political awareness, the understanding of what it means to be engaged in the conversation about race and the sort of foundations of this country are natural to her, which made our relationship much more possible, right? Because if someone is not bringing that level of awareness to a relationship with me, it becomes quite difficult, because I don't want to have to educate them to bring them up to that conversation, which to me is so basic and imperative right now in the culture. So, you know, it was a real meeting of the minds, a real meeting of the spirit, of the heart. And we've been able to really transform that into the collaborative, deep friendship and admiration that we feel for each other. That is in evidence today, and that I feel so grateful for. So yeah, so great. Yale brought us together again, you know.
Love this story. It is so inspiring. I love that it was a Yale club that started that. That is amazing to hear. And I'm sure they will love to hear that as well. So my last question for the both of you both are activists in your own right. You have now been friends, mentor, mentee for many years. You've recently written a book together called What's Your Story? I can see it in the back of Rebecca's, there you go. So how is what you're doing now with this, a journal, but is it okay to call it a journal or a book? I'm not sure.
You prefer. Call it a journal. It's an interactive journal.
Yes. How is that having an impact with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I'll start off by saying I think we're, as a collective, in a really cataclysmic moment, as you know, in our various communities, in our families, individually, as a nation, and also in the world. You know, we're at this moment where we, for the past year, have been dealing with multiple pandemics, the pandemic, you know, the viral pandemic, the pandemic of white supremacy, racism, really seeking to understand how we have gotten here, what it means for us to be living through this story at this moment, and then what it means to reckon with that story and to find a new story that we can move forward with, that will not continue to degenerate our humanity and who we are, you know, as all of these various levels of community. And the book, What's Your Story? The subtitle is A Journal for Everyday Evolution. And our work with that was really to coalesce, you know, a couple hundred questions that allow us as individuals to go from the most intimate parts of, you know, our minds, our bodies, our relationships, our work, out to the way that we relate to technology, to the natural world, to community, to, you know, our homes, and then all the way through to our mortality, and to really assess and understand how we have written stories that are perhaps supportive to us in some arenas, and in other arenas deeply deficient. And many of those we find are stories that we have taken on from the dominant narrative that our culture has given us. And so, you know, as we are, particularly white Americans, have reckoned with over the past year, looking at the narrative of white supremacy and how deeply entrenched it is, not just in our institutions, but literally in, you know, every way that we are taught and even allowed to conceive of ourselves and to conceive of relationships, to conceive of the ways that we take care of ourselves. And so my work is very much about democratizing wellness and reconnecting with our birthright to have a relationship to the natural world. We, as we know, through yet another pandemic, but the crisis of climate, of the environment that we are all now dealing with, that we've just seen, so brutally visit Texas and the South, how ill-equipped we are because of these other, linked systems of oppression that have kept us from understanding our interconnection with the natural world and ways that we must live in greater harmony with the environment if we are going to establish an enduring relationship that doesn't basically, cave in on itself ultimately at the end. So this book, What's Your Story? This journal is a way for each of us to really take accountability. And I've kind of likened it to creating a sort of personal constitution that allows us to really invest in an accounting of who we are now, who we how that looks in comparison to the stories being told all around us, and in comparison to the stories that perhaps we were born with or that we carried with us to this moment. And what are the stories that we want to carry forward, and how can we rewrite stories that are not ones of deep, formidable oppression, that are the same as those that we've carried with us to this point.
Great. And I would add, the fundamental idea of What's Your Story has to do with trying to help people understand that we are all living a story in our mind, a story of how we're supposed to love one another, how we're supposed to feel about our body, how we're supposed to engage with technology, how we're supposed to think about death, how we're supposed to think about the earth. We've been given stories, given ideas, and we're all walking around pretty much acting out that story. And so through the prompts in each section of the book, which, again, your body, your community, the earth, technology, your death, your family, all of these different sections of the book ask questions about your relationship in each of those areas. So through kind of interrogating the old stories that you've inherited, that you've been reifying, that you have been living in a habituated way, we are asking you to understand that you have the ability to imagine and co-create a different story that you can live, that is more aligned with your higher aspirations for yourself, your family, your community, the earth, and that may diverge dramatically from the kind of status quo ideas that people have been holding for hundreds or maybe decades, tens of years, however long they've been in your mind and in your family's mind and the culture's mind. And we this book has, we've had a tremendously powerful response as people have taken it into their lives and taken it. We've heard about mothers and daughters taking 5 questions each every night and sharing their responses, right? So they're trying to co-create a new story, not just of these different elements, these different areas, but also a new story of the mother-daughter relationship. We've had Facebook groups who are all doing it together as a collective and trying to kind of raise the level of consciousness and new stories that can be born in a collective community setting. And of course, there are the people who are individually, finding a quiet space to disconnect from the sort of rapid fire world of this technocracy that we're in, and return to a more introspective, meditative space that is more analog and more open to being able to hear the truth in your own mind, not distracted, right? Who are using the book to really excavate and be honest with themselves to the best of their ability, and to imagine in their own worlds, their own minds, how they want to change and how they want to evolve. So we're calling it, the book, A Journal for Everyday Evolution, because the goal, the hope, is that as we all become the writers of our own stories, if we all decide that we want to be in sync with our best nature in terms of how we live every day, we will begin to understand that in order to do that, we have to write this new story that supports that desire. And so the book really is a way to do that work. And it's been, I think, very impactful. I know it's been impactful for Lily and I to do, for me and Lily to do. It's been, the feedback has been tremendous. And we've had an opportunity now to talk to many people who are actually using the book. And we've also been able to start to talk to people who are really engaged in the process of changing their story, or who have already changed their story, and so have really inspired us and affirmed this work. Talking to people who have changed the story of motherhood for themselves when they find out they have a trans child. Speaking to people who have decided to live, within a 400 square foot space with their partner, their dog, their kid, because they want to live more lightly on the earth. People who are actively engaged in this work. So yeah, we hope that it continues to find its way into the hands of the people who need it, and continues to contribute to rewriting the story, not just of individuals, but of our country, which is in desperate need of rewriting at this moment.
Well, I will say congratulations to both of you on this book. I thank the Yale universe for bringing the two of you together. And Rebecca and Lily, we thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
You are so welcome. We're so happy that you're all out there still making impact. It gives us really hope. So we're looking forward to seeing you all.